Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be returning to Revolt Against the Modern World by Julius Evola. I looked at this book a long time ago, early in the podcast, several years ago, 5-6 years ago maybe, probably 5 years ago. And I reviewed it then. I liked it, but I also found it kind of challenging. I think I've read a lot more since then, and I've reviewed some portions of this, looked back on it, and I think I get it more now than I did then. And I sort of wanted to come back and revisit it, so today I'm going to do that. I'm not going to look at major portions of the book. I really want to stick to the beginning. None of my parts that I'm going to read to you extend past page 39. So this is really a bunch of stuff from the beginning of the book that I want to look at in more close detail. Obviously, I read some sections in the last episode that I did on this book. I'm not going to reread any of those sections, and I would certainly encourage you to go back and give that a listen. The cringiness aside, it was early in my podcast, and hopefully my show isn't quite so cringy now as it was then. But nevertheless, I talked about some interesting things in that episode, particularly about time, how he talks about the traditional world is really outside of history and outside of time, and it's not the case that the traditional world happened before the modern world. Contingently, we live on a planet where where that happened that way, but he says it's not necessarily the case that that it has to happen that way. There's an entirely separate mode of living that's the traditional way, and then there's the modern way, and they're just two different ways of being. And he conflates the first traditional way of being with connection to a higher plane of reality. And he says basically the whole traditional world is based on this connection with this higher transcendent order. And the modern world is fundamentally a disconnect from this. And so he kind of places all of the problems of modernity on some variety of materialism. As a materialist, obviously, I disagree. And I think that his fundamental premise about the transcendent order is incorrect. The spiritual order, the spiritual world, it's all a little bit fuzzy, unfortunately, and maybe it's partly fuzzy because I didn't get it when I read it the first time around. And I didn't find, this is not my only Evola book. I also looked at the Handbook for Right-Wing Youth by Evola, and that was really interesting. And I looked at Men Among the Ruins, which was also interesting, although that was, I think, my least favorite of the Evola books I've read so far. And I think I've always found it a little bit, I don't know, part of it seems vague, even though parts of it seem like he goes into tremendous amounts of detail about things. Nevertheless, it always seems to me to be sitting on a vague conjecture. And maybe I just consider it vague because I consider it incorrect. And so I'm less inclined to think of it as like specific and clearly defined. I think it's not. And so despite the fact that I deeply disagree with Evola about the basic most premise he offers, I still find it compelling content and interesting, and I kind of almost want to live in a world like what he describes here. I'm a fan of Monarchy. He talks about Monarchy. I kind of like the world he describes in some aspects, less so in other aspects, but I just, he proposes basically that, well, it's necessary to have a spiritual view of reality in order to live that sort of life, and opposite that, you get the modern world and all of its flaws. So, there's a fundamental premise I disagree with, but I still like it and I want to try to understand it. I recently was talking all kinds of trash about Evola on social media. I think I was probably a little overzealous. I called it a bunch of BS, which it's not really BS, but I have a hard time getting around to the fact that I disagree with him so fundamentally about materialism and the nature of reality. So I want to talk a little bit about my disagreements as well as about parts that I agree with here in this episode. I want to focus on where he talks about monarchy and how an aristocracy and his kind of political perspective, how his fundamental premise affects his political outlook. So that's what I want to look at. I'm going to read, I think, one section from most of these first 6 chapters. The chapters are all very short, but I'm going to read a little bit out of a bunch of these just to get his basic ideas. So jumping right in here to his overview of his project, this is from the foreword. He says, quote, "The order of things that I will mainly deal with in this present work, generally speaking, is that in which all materials having a historical and scientific value are the ones that matter the least. Conversely, all the mythical, legendary, and epic elements denied historical truth and demonstrative value acquire here a superior validity, and become the source for a more real and certain knowledge. This is precisely the boundary that separates the traditional doctrine from profane culture. In reference to ancient times, this does not apply to the forms of a mythological or superhistorical life such as the traditional one. While from the perspective of science, what matters in a myth is whatever historical elements may be extracted from it. From the perspective that I adopt, what matters in history are all the mythological elements it has to offer, or all the myths that enter into its web as integrations of the meaning of history itself. Not only the Rome of legends speaks clearer words than the historical Rome, but even the sagas of Charlemagne reveal more about the meaning of the King of the Franks than the positive chronicles and documents of that time, and so on. The scientific anathemas in regards to this approach are well known. Arbitrary, subjective, preposterous. In my perspective, there is no arbitrariness, subjectivity, or fantasy, just like there is no objectivity and scientific causality the way modern men understand them. All these notions are unreal. All these notions are outside tradition. Tradition begins wherever it is possible to rise above these notions, by achieving a super-individual and non-human perspective. Thus, I will have a minimal concern for debating and demonstrating. The truths that may reveal the world of tradition are not those that can be learned or discussed. Either they are, or they are not. It is only possible to remember them, and this happens when one becomes free of the obstacles represented by various human constructions, first among which are all the results and the methods of specialized researchers. In other words, one becomes free of these encumbrances when the capacity for seeing from that non-human perspective, which is the same as the traditional perspective, has been attained. This is one of the essential protests that should be made by those who really oppose the modern world. Let me repeat that in every ancient persuasion, traditional truths have always been regarded as non-human. Any consideration from a non-human perspective, which is objective in a transcendent sense, is a traditional consideration that should be made to correspond to the traditional world. Universality is typical of this world. The axiom, that which is everywhere, that which is from everyone, and that which is always, characterizes it. Inherent to the idea of traditional civilization is the idea of an equivalence or homology of its various forms realized in space and time. The correspondences may not be noticeable from the outside. One may be taken aback by the diversity of several possible and yet equivalent expressions. In some cases, the correspondences are respected in the spirit, in other cases only formally and nominally. In some cases, there may be more complete applications of principles, in others more fragmentary ones. In some, there are legendary expressions, in others, historical expressions. And yet there is always something constant and central that characterizes the same world and the same man, and determines an identical opposition vis-a-vis everything that is modern. Those who begin from a particular traditional civilization and are able to integrate it by freeing it from its historical and contingent aspects, and thus bring back the generative principles to the metaphysical plane where they exist in a pure state, so to speak, they cannot help but recognize these same principles behind the different expressions of other equally traditional civilizations. It is in this way that a sense of certainty and of transcendent and universal objectivity is innerly established, that nothing could ever destroy, and that could not be reached by any other means. In the course of this book, I will refer to various Eastern and Western traditions, choosing those that exemplify, through a clearer and more complete expression, the same spiritual principle or phenomenon. The method that I use has as little in common with the eclecticism or comparative methodology of modern scholars as the method of parallaxes, which is used to determine the exact position of a star by reference to how it appears from different places. Also, this method has as little in common with eclecticism, to borrow an image of Guénon's, as the multilingual person's choice of the language that best expresses a given thought. Thus, what I call traditional method is usually characterized by a double principle, ontologically and objectively by the principle of correspondence, which ensures an essential and functional correlation between analogous elements, presenting them as simple homologous forms of the appearance of a central and unitary meaning, and epistemologically and subjectively by the generalized use of the principle of induction, which is here understood as a discursive approximation of a spiritual intuition, in which what is realized is the integration and the unification of the diverse elements encountered in the same one meaning and in the same one principle. In this way, I will try to portray the sense of the world of tradition as a unity, and as a universal type capable of creating points of reference and of evaluation different from the ones to which the majority of the people in the West have passively and semi-consciously become accustomed. This sense can also lead to the establishment of the foundations for an eventual revolt, not a polemical but a real and positive one, of the spirit against the modern world." End quote. So that was sort of an overview of his task here, and brings about the main points with which I have disagreement with Evola. So I want to draw your attention to a few spots in particular. He opens up basically saying that everything that is historical and scientific, it doesn't have as much value. He says those things matter least. The mythical, legendary, and epic elements matter more. They matter the most. And that's the source for a more real and certain knowledge. Now, I love mythology. I read mythology and I am interested in it. But I have a hard time saying that the contents of mythology are somehow more real than the material world. This is the core dispute I have with Evola. It all kind of ties into the same thing, but the world of myth, the legends, the intuitions, the spiritual intuitions, the various aspects of religion, and belief about things that are intangible. Those beliefs are not beliefs about a more real reality. Something else, something external to the material world that's more real and more valuable and more important and prior to and superior to the material world. The material world is the superior form, and mythology is only conceptual, and concepts are only patterns that in neurological activity shared by people with one another, mimicked from one to the other, mimicking neurological activity. Those are shared concepts. They are qualities of the material world. So the material world is prior to concepts. The material world is more real than concepts. Concepts are interesting and concepts are worthy of study. Concepts are important and maybe necessary to functional well, of course they're necessary to functional civilizations. They're incredibly important, but they're not more real than the material world. That's the fundamental difference. I don't think there is anything that's more real than the material world, that is superior or prior to the material world. No such thing exists. When we speak about such a thing, we're usually in an oblique way referring to the contents of our own subconscious minds. That's what I believe. And that's, deeply in disagreement with Evola's point. In particular, where he says, "I will have a minimal concern for debating and demonstrating. The truths that may reveal the world of tradition are not those that can be learned or discussed. Either they are or they are not. It is only possible to remember them. And this happens when one becomes free of the obstacles represented by various human constructions, first among which are all the results and methods of specialized researchers. In other words, one becomes free of these encumbrances when the capacity for seeing from that non-human perspective, which is the same as the traditional perspective, has been attained. So, in other words, you acquire the capacity to see things from a non-human perspective in your mind's eye. You're not seeing things with your eyes. You're seeing things with your mind. These are not sensory inputs from the light spectrum, which is material. All the things you see with your eyes are material. But a different way of seeing from a non-human perspective, once that is attained, that's the only way that you can remember. You can't learn or discuss the ways of tradition, the world of tradition. You can't learn it, you can't discuss it, you can only remember it. And this sounds kind of similar to what I talked about in the other Evola episode, when I talked about when I imagine a sort of traditional world, or I imagine a world of where I would like our society to be, what I would like things to look like. I don't point back to a particular time period, but I imagine it. I have an ideal vision. I have a vision in my mind's eye of what I want it to look like. And did I craft that vision myself, or did it spring to me through my intuitions? Maybe there's some part of both. I thought about things and the way they are, and I thought about how I would like them to be, and I thought about what has been, and different bits and pieces of what has been in the past at different times. And I hodgepodged a sort of collage of things I like, and daydreamed it into existence and said, that's what I want the world to look like. Something like that. All my favorite things from that have existed in the world or that might exist. That's the idealized vision. I could probably convince myself that I actually remembered that vision of a world in some way from before I was born. You know, if you have a powerful vision of something, you might say, I'm not imagining this. This is coming into my mind from an external source. It's a memory of something that once existed, or a memory of something that maybe never really existed, but another world, a vision of another world. And that's the only way you can know what he's talking about, or that whether anything he says is true, is by remembering it. So at base, there's just like a major trust me bro here. He's not going to demonstrate anything. He's not going to debate anything or demonstrate anything. It either it's true or it's not true, and you'll know it. We'll know it when you know it. I can't carry that too far. You know, I used to believe, and I'll be truthful with you, I used to believe in a lot of this stuff. I had my tarot cards. I had my books on the occult, my shamanism studies. I used to be into this kind of thing. I used to really believe this stuff. And eventually at some point, you just stop and say, wait a minute. None of this stuff has ever been verified by anybody who's actually being careful and not just using their, trusting their imagination to be, as good as any other source of information. At some point, you stop and you say, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. At least I think you should. The other thing I wanted to point to in this part is where he says, I will refer to various Eastern and Western traditions, choosing those that exemplify through a clearer and more complete expression the same spiritual principle or phenomenon. So there's a couple things here. One is that he's proposing that there's something underlying all sorts of mystical traditions from across the world, East and West. There's some sort of truth that's in there that they share, and by looking at all of them, you can uncover what that truth is. So there's a couple problems here. One is that actually there's so much diversity between what different traditions propose that they're in direct conflict with one another. Their fundamental truths are in opposition with one another, and there may be some circumstances where there are shared ideas, but how much of those shared ideas come from common human archetypes of the subconscious mind come from the neurological structures of the brain common to human beings, the experiences such as motherhood and fatherhood that are common to human beings. The fact that there is a sun in the sky that shines over everybody and provides us all with our source of life means that the sun probably plays a major role in world religions. It doesn't mean that there's some deeper truth represented by the sun by the fact that it is present in multiple religions. The other thing that this points to is what sort of eclecticism he's working with. And he sort of denies being eclectic. He says this is as similar to eclecticism as would be someone who is looking for the right phrase to say, and they choose which language. They speak multiple languages, and they might use one language to say this phrase and another language to say that phrase because different phrases are expressed better in different languages. Is that eclectic, or is that using the tools at hand to express the concept in the most clear manner? So he sort of says it's not really eclectic, but whatever it is, he's reaching across a multitude of traditions to find what he's after. And if it's from Hinduism or Buddhism or Shinto or shamanism or ancient Greek paganism, wherever it's from, he'll find bits and pieces of mystical traditions and patch them together to get to some sort of grand, true idea. So this is ideological eclecticism. He'll go to any source to get those things which conform with the idea, and he will look at the people who have grasped hold of this idea, and he will say, those are my people. Those are the traditionalists across time and space who have seen the noble truth. And I'm a bit of an eclectic myself, but I'm the opposite sort of eclectic. Whereas I will say, okay, amongst my people, amongst my forefathers, my national history, the thinkers from the United States, and more broadly than that, the thinkers from other peoples who are the founding stock of my civilization. So the people of England, and also the people of Germany, who are also major founding stock of the United States. These are my kin, my genetic kin. These are my cultural kin, more so than the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Shintos, or the African shamans. Now, I can look to the Enlightenment, I can look to the monarchies, I can look to the Romantics, I can look to the Renaissance, I can look to the ancient Greeks or the ancient Anglo-Saxons. I can look to the British empiricists, the fascists, the communists, the critical theorists, the movement conservatives, the fusionists, the pragmatists. I can look to all sorts of sources with all sorts of different ideas and extract the ideas from these different peoples that ring true or that seem functionally beneficial for me in this moment in the history of my civilization. But I'm not going outside of my civilization to find people who share my ideological standpoint. If you go to other external foreign civilizations to find people who share your ideas, you are an ideological globalist. If you look to your nation's history, your people's history, for your tools, you are an eclectic nationalist. And I'm an eclectic nationalist, not an ideological globalist, which is what Evola is. So, anyhow, let's move to the next section. I want to get to the section that was really my interest here, which is that of monarchy. So I'm going to jump forward at this point. I guess I'm going to skip over. I thought about reading a section from chapter 1, the beginning, but I'm going to skip right over that. I want to look at chapter 2, regality. He says, quote, "Every traditional civilization is characterized by the presence of beings who, by virtue of their innate or acquired superiority over the human condition, embody within the temporal order the living and efficacious presence of a power that comes from above. One of these types of beings is the pontifex, according to the inner meaning of the word, and according to the original value of the function that he exercised. Pontifex means builder of bridges, or of paths. Pons in ancient times also meant path. Connecting the natural and the supernatural dimensions. Moreover, the pontifex was traditionally identified with the king, or rex. Servius, a late 4th century commentator on Virgil's works, reports, "The custom of our ancestors was that the king should also be pontifex and priest." A saying of the Nordic tradition reads, "May our leader be our bridge." Thus, real monarchs were the steadfast personification of the life beyond ordinary life. Beneficial spiritual influences used to radiate upon the world of mortal beings from the mere presence of such men, from their pontifical mediation, from the power of the rites that were rendered efficacious by their power, and from the institutions of which they were the center. These influences permeated people's thoughts, intentions, and actions, ordering every aspect of their lives, and constituting a fit foundation for luminous spiritual realizations. These influences also made propitious the general conditions for prosperity, health, and good fortune. In the world of tradition, the most important foundation of the authority and of the right of kings and chiefs, and the reason why they were obeyed, feared, and venerated, was essentially their transcendent and non-human quality. This quality was not artificial, but a powerful reality to be feared. The more people acknowledged the ontological rank of what was prior and superior to the visible and temporal dimension, the more such beings were invested with a natural and absolute sovereign power. Traditional civilizations, unlike those of decadent and later times, completely ignored the merely political dimension of supreme authority, as well as the idea that the roots of authority lay in mere strength, violence, or natural and secular qualities such as intelligence, wisdom, physical courage, and a minute concern for the collective material well-being. The roots of authority, on the contrary, always had a metaphysical character. Likewise, the idea that the power to govern is conferred on the chiefs by those whom he rules, and that his authority is the expression of the community, and therefore subject to its decrees, was foreign to tradition. It is Zeus who bestows the Themistys on kings of divine origin, whereby Themis, or law from above, is very different from what constitutes the nomos, which is the political law of the community. The root of every temporal power was spiritual authority, which was almost a divine nature disguised in human form. According to an Indo-European view, the ruler is not a mere mortal, but rather a great deity standing in the form of a man. The Egyptian pharaoh was believed to be the manifestation of Ra, or of Horus. The kings of Alba and of Rome were supposed to be the incarnations of Zeus, the Assyrian kings of Baal, the Persian shahs of the god of light. The Nordic Germanic princes were believed to derive from the race of Tammuz, of Odin, and of the Aesir. And the Greek kings of the Doric Achaean cycle were called Dioptraces, or Diogenes, in reference to their divine origin. Beyond the variety of mythical and sacred expressions, the recurrent view of kingship is expressed in the terms of an immanent transcendence that is present and active in the world. The king, who was believed to be a sacred being and not a man, by virtue of his being, was already the center and the apex of the community. In him was also the supernatural strength that made his ritual actions efficacious. In these actions, people could recognize the earthly counterpart of supernatural ruling, as well as the supernatural support of life in the world of tradition. For this reason, kingship was the supreme form of government, and was believed to be in the natural order of things. It did not need physical strength to assert itself, and when it did, it was only sporadically. It imposed itself mainly and irresistibly through the spirit. In an ancient Indo-Aryan text, it is written, "The dignity a god enjoys on earth is splendid, but hard to achieve for the weak. Only he who sets his soul on this objective is worthy to become a king." The ruler appears as a follower of the discipline that is practiced by those who are gods among men. In tradition, kingship was often associated with the solar symbol. In the king, people saw the same glory and victory proper to the sun and to the light, the symbols of the superior nature, which every morning overcomes darkness. Every day he rises on Horus's throne as king of the living, just like his father Ra the sun. And also, I have decreed that you must eternally rise as king of the north and of the south, on the seat of Horus like the sun. These sayings from the ancient Egyptian royal tradition bear a striking similarity to the sayings of the Persian tradition, in which the king is believed to be of the same stock as the gods. He has the same throne of Mithras, and he rises with the sun. He is called Particeps Siderum, and Lord of Peace, salvation of mankind, eternal man, winner who rises in company of the sun. In ancient Persia, the consecrating formula was, Thou art power, the force of victory, and immortal, made of gold, thou rise at dawn together with Indra and with the sun. In the Indo-Aryan tradition, in reference to Rohita, who is the conquering force and who personifies an aspect of the radiance of the divine fire, Agni, we find, By coming forward, Agni has created kingship in this world. He has conferred on you, Rohita, majesty and victory over your enemies. In some ancient Roman representations, the god Sol, or sun, presents the emperor with a sphere, which is the symbol of universal dominion. Also, the expressions Sol Conservator and Sol Dominus Romani Imperii, which are employed to describe Rome's stability and ruling power, refer to the brightness of the sun. The last Roman profession of faith was solar. Since the last representative of the ancient Roman tradition, the Emperor Julian, consecrated his dynasty, his birth, and royal condition to the brightness of the sun, which he considered to be a spiritual force radiating from the higher worlds. A reflection of the solar symbol was preserved up to the time of Ghibelline emperors. One may still speak of a Deatas Solis in reference to Frederick II of Hohenstaufen. This solar glory or victory, in reference to kingship, was not reduced to a mere symbol, but rather denoted a metaphysical reality. Eventually it came to be identified with a non-human operating force, which the king did not possess in and by himself. End quote. So here we get a bit about monarchy and kingship. And he states probably his thesis most clearly here when he says, in the world of tradition, the most important foundation of the authority and of the right of kings and chiefs, and the reason why they were obeyed, feared, and venerated was essentially their transcendent and non-human quality. There's something special about the king, and the specialness is, it's supposed to be sort of perceived by the people, but I think also the fact of the person's position as king bestows the specialness, as much as it might seem that to the ancient traditional world it was vice versa. His kingship was bestowed upon him by divine power. Divine power acts through the actions that occur in the world that position one into the position of kingship. That's the mechanism by which the power beyond would have to use to put this person into power. Material causes, the material circumstances of their kingship. But they didn't see it that way, apparently. They saw it as being that the king was... But also there are questions of who is worthy to become a king. Only one who sets his soul on the objective of achieving the dignity of a god is worthy to become a king. And followers of the disciple that is practiced by those who are gods. So there's certain criteria that the king has to display, but on the whole, has nothing to do with any of his worldly actions. Wars, strength, conquering power. Its source is always in the transcendent. But what is, it's always a question. Maybe it's Zeus. Maybe it's the god of light for the Persians, or Odin for the Nordics. The way Evola talks about it, it more seems as though there is a spiritual transcendent force of rulership that is manifested in the various gods, so that Zeus or Odin or one of these other gods grants kingship to the king. But they're not all the same god. They're all different gods. But what is common among them is the force of kingship being bestowed. So there's an almost a divine kingship as a power that flows through the individual gods that are particular to the one people or another people, depending on who the people are, some different god is going to stand in that role and bestow the power of rulership and kingship to the king. So you can sort of start to get a grasp of the qualities, and this is one of my complaints about Evola, was that the qualities of this superior realm are not really given very clearly, because so many things are at variance in here. Who is the god who's bestowing? What is the nature of this god or that god that bestows the kingship? They're not the same. Odin is not the same as Zeus. Their stories are a little different. Their qualities are a little different. But then when you see what he's trying to pull out as permanent, you can get a closer idea on what he's claiming that the nature of the transcendent is. But what I find is that his descriptions of the nature of the transcendent, and one of those descriptions being that it involves the power of authority and rulership, in those premises in turn derive from his initial premise, I believe. It seems that there is the fact that there is a superior realm is taken as a source of information. So you then have two realms, a higher one and a lower one. And by this division into higher and lower, you gain the concept of superior and inferior. You gain the concept of rulership and ruled. And the higher realm rules over the lower realm. And so if we're tracking back to the original data point that prompted these concepts, it comes back to the mere fact of existence of the higher realm, which is the singular, inexplicable premise that has to be remembered. It's a single basic thing, the existence of a transcendent world that can't itself in any way be demonstrated or proved. It's the thing it's the ultimate trust me bro at the core of this sort of traditionalist, transcendent, perennialist philosophy. But I suppose if the transcendent world is sort of unknowable, then all you can say is that it exists, and that it is transcendent. And then from that fact that you've postulated, you can draw out all of the various conclusions that have to do with monarchy and the sun and the various, qualities that he proposes throughout the rest of this book. So let's jump to the next section. He talks a little bit more here about the axis of reality, the higher and lower, the superior and inferior worlds, the connections between them, the bridge of the leader, connecting the two worlds together. He says, quote, "We may consider the Hindu notion of the Chakravartin, or universal king. The Chakravartin may be considered the archetype of the regal function, of which various kings represent more or less complete images or even particular expressions whenever they conform to the traditional principle. Chakravartin literally means lord or spinner of the wheel. This notion brings us back again to the idea of a center that corresponds also to an inner state, to a way of being, or better yet, to the way of being. Actually, the wheel also symbolizes samsara, or the stream of becoming. The Hellenes called it the wheel of generation, or the wheel of fate. Its motionless center signifies the spiritual stability inherent in those who are not affected by this stream and who can organize and subject to a higher principle the energies and the activities connected to the inferior nature. Thus, the Chakravartin appears as the Dharmaraja, the lord of the law, or the lord of the wheel of the law. According to Confucius, the practice of government by means of virtue may be compared to the pole star, which the multitudinous stars pay homage to while it stays in its place. Hence the meaning of the concept of revolution, which is the motion occurring around an unmoved mover, though in our modern day and age it has become synonymous with subversion. In this sense, royalty assumes the value of a pole, by referring to a general traditional symbolism. We may recall here, besides Midgard, the heavenly middle abode, described in Nordic traditions, Plato's reference to the place where Zeus holds council with the gods in order to reach a decision concerning the fate of Atlantis. He accordingly summoned all the gods to his own most glorious abode, which stands at the center of the universe and looks out over the whole realm of change. The above-mentioned notion of Chakravartin, also connected to a cycle of enigmatic traditions concerning the real existence of a center of the world that exercises this supreme function here on Earth. Some fundamental symbols of regality had originally a close relationship with these ideas. One of these symbols was the scepter, the main function of which is analogically related to the axis of the world. Another symbol is the throne, an elevated place. Sitting still on the throne evokes, in addition to the meaning of stability, connected to the pole and to the unmoved mover, the corresponding inner and metaphysical meanings. Considering the correspondence that was originally believed to exist between the nature of the royal man and the nature produced by initiation, in the classical mysteries we find a ritual consisting of sitting still on a throne. This ritual appears to have been very important since it was sometimes equated with initiation itself. The term tethruisenos, enthroned, is often synonymous with teletesmenos, initiate. In fact, in some instances, in the course of initiation, the thronismos, or royal enthronement, preceded the experience of becoming one with the god. The same symbolism is embodied in the ziggurat, the Assyrian-Babylonian terraced pyramid, as well as in the master plan of the capital of the Persian kings, as in Ecbatana, and in the ideal image of the Chakravartin's royal palace. In these places we find the architectural expression of the cosmic order, complete in its hierarchy and in its dependence upon an unmoved center. From a spatial perspective, this center corresponded within the building itself to the king's throne. Similar to Hellas, in India we find forms of initiation that employ the ritual of the so-called mandala. These forms dramatize the gradual ascent of the initiate from the profane and demonic space to a sacred space, until he reaches a center. A fundamental ritual symbolizing this journey is called Mukatabhisaka, and it consists in being crowned or in being given a tiara. He who reaches the center of the mandala is crowned as king, because he is now believed to be above the interplay of the forces at work in the inferior nature. It is interesting that the ziggurat, the sacred building towering above the city-state, of which it was the center, was called Cornerstone in Babylon and Link between Heaven and Earth in Lhasa. The theme of the rock and of the bridge is pretty much summed up in the Far Eastern expression, third power between heaven and earth. End quote. So you have a sort of centrality discussed here. The first thing he talks about, he talks a little bit about the Hindu notion of the Chakravartin, or universal king. And he says that it seems like this is a sort of archetypal king. He says the Chakravartin may be considered the archetype of the regal function. So it doesn't even sound like it's necessarily a real title of a real king somewhere, but sort of like written about in Hindu writings and Hindu mythology as the perfect king, the universal king, the archetypal power of kingship. And it's literally means the spinner of the wheel. And then we talk about the wheel a little bit here. And I think this is interesting. This has come up in previous episodes when I was talking about Plato and the myth at the end of his Republic, and about Ananke and necessity. I believe this was in the episode on Cornford's book, From Religion to Philosophy. I talked a little bit about that. And I talked about Ananke as the spinner of the spinning wheel. Fate spinning the spindle is the symbol associated with Ananke, and there's a sort of weaving or spinning of fate, right? And this relates, I think, to the concept of the world as a rotating thing that has an axis at the center of it. And this is sort of how the ancient Greeks and how many ancient people, I think, understood the world. Now, the question becomes, what is that? In the modern world, we could say that our galaxy rotates sort of in this manner around a central point, but there's no pole at the center of the galaxy, and there are many galaxies. And it's a sort of spiritual concept. It's a sort of a metaphysical concept. We don't really live in a world that really has a pole, and we're not really rotating around anything. And so, as a metaphysical concept, what can we do with it? We can say it's a sort of symbol of all things moving and churning, and yet at the same time having a reference point that they all share with one another. And this central pole or axis is sort of the one thing that doesn't change its position. It's the central pole. It's the North Star, the Pole Star. It's the unmoved mover, the driving force that keeps everything else churning around. Can be associated with Monarchy, and in Abrahamic religions is associated with God. Now, it can be postulated that logic demands an unmoved mover, but I'm not sure how true that is. And I think that the whole vision of the rotating around the central axis is a concept of reality that indicates some singular stable force, something that's not moving. But if we're not rotating, I don't know why we would have to have reference to a single unmoved point. I'm not certain. But then again, I don't necessarily see an endless sequence of cause and effect that doesn't have a beginning point to be a real logical contradiction. An infinite series of causes and effects. An infinite regression. I'm not sure why that's inconceivable or impossible, that there has to be a first cause. Now, we have a Big Bang, but we've also theorized that the Big Bang came after as a result of something, or came after something. It has been theorized, at least, infinitely expanding and contracting in some manner. And then we would have an eternal universe, an eternal world. And I wonder, does it correspond to something internal, something about us and the way we see the world? Because I experience the world as if I am the center in a sphere. When I look around me, I can look up, down, left, right. I can look at 360 degrees in any direction, as if I was the center of a sphere. And of course, I stand upright. There are two distinct directions in this sphere that stand out for being particular, and one of them is straight down, and one of them is straight up. And I stand kind of like a pole or an axis, and I have a down and I have an up, and I'm surrounded by the world, and I'm surrounded by the things that are moving around to my left and to my right, but upwards is pretty much just the sky, and there's things up there, and downward is just the earth, and it's not, but all in left, right, and forward and to the sides are as a sort of a flat disc of my experience of the earth. And on this flat disc of the earth, there's people moving around. So I experience things as if I am the axis and the world is the rotating inferior nature, and I'm the permanent unmoving axis. Even as I walk around, my experience remains the same. I remain in the center of my world. And do we confer onto reality that same vision that is really the human experience of reality? So what is metaphysics really but the translation of reality into terms that are comprehensible to the human experience? Anyway, I'm going to jump forward here to the point where he talks about law. And he says, quote, "The traditional society's view of both the law and the state is closely related to the order of ideas that I've been discussing so far. Generally speaking, a transcendent realism is the presupposition of the traditional notion of the law. Especially in Aryan formulations, the notion of law has an intimate relationship with the notions of truth, reality, and stability inherent to that which is. In the Vedas, the term Rata often has the same meaning as Dharma. It not only signifies the order found in the world as order or cosmos, but it has a deeper meaning whenever it designates truth, law, or reality, just as its opposite, anarta, designates falsehood, evil, or unreality. Thus, the world of the law, and consequently of the state, came to be equated with the world of truth and of reality in the eminent sense of the word. As a natural consequence, traditional man either ignored or considered absurd the idea that one could talk about laws and the obedience due them as if the laws in question had a mere human origin, whether individual or collective. Every law, in order to be regarded as an objective law, had to have a divine character. Once the divine character of a law was sanctioned, and its origin traced back to a non-human tradition, then its authority became absolute. This law became something ineffable, inflexible, immutable, and beyond criticism. Thus, every transgression of such law was regarded not so much as a crime against society, but rather and foremost as sacrilege, or as an act of impiety, or aceibia, or as an act that jeopardized the spiritual destiny of the person who disobeyed it, as well as of the people with whom that person was socially related. This is why, up to and including medieval civilization, rebellion against authority and the imperial law was considered as serious a crime as religious heresy. Thus, the rebels were considered just like heretics, namely, as the enemies of their own natures, and as beings who contradicted the law of their very own being. Aryan India employed a special expression to designate those who broke the caste law. They were called the fallen ones, or the lapsed. The usefulness of the law, in the modern sense of the word, that is, its collective and empirical usefulness, was never the true criterion adopted in ancient times. Not that this aspect was never considered, but it was rather thought to be an accessory or a consequential aspect in every law, once a law was sanctioned as true. After all, there are different views of what constitute usefulness. The notion of usefulness is the ultimate materialistic criterion of modern society, though that was not the case in traditional societies, which rather regarded it as a means to be employed in the function of a higher purpose. But for a law to be considered useful, it was necessary to appear as something other than a mere and repealable creation of the human will. Once it was established that its authority originated from above, its usefulness and efficacy were definitely acknowledged. This certainty was never questioned, even in those cases in which experience, in the most immediate and unrefined meaning of the word, did not confirm and even proved such a law to be wrong somehow, since, as the saying goes, the web of heaven's way is complex and incomprehensible. This is why, in the traditional world, the creation of a system of laws and rituals was always attributed to divine legislators or to divine mediators. These beings, in turn, were considered as various forms of apparitions of the Lord of the Center, or King of Justice, the forms being determined by different geographical areas and by different populations. And even when, in more recent times, the electoral system was introduced, tradition retained a partial, formal existence when the people's decision was not considered to be sufficient. In that case, in order for new laws to be finally ratified, it was necessary to obtain the approval of the pontifexes, and to make sure that the diviners ascertained whether these laws enjoyed the gods' approval. Moreover, laws and institutions, as in the case of all traditional civilizations, were both from above and oriented upwards. A political, economic, and social order created merely for the sake of temporal life is exclusively characteristic of the modern world, that is, of the anti-traditional world. Traditionally, the state had a transcendent meaning and purpose that were not inferior to the ones the Catholic Church claimed for itself in the West as a manifestation of and a path to the world above. The very term state, in Latin status, from the Greek istanai, to stay, empirically may have derived from the form of social life taken up by nomadic populations once they permanently settled down. However, it may also point to a higher meaning, namely to an order concerned with hierarchical participation in a spiritual stability, as opposed to the contingent, unstable, changeable, chaotic, and particularistic character of naturalistic existence. This order constituted the accurate reflection of the world of being in the world of becoming. Hence the words pronounced in the course of a Vedic royal consecration. The world of the living is steady, and so is the king of the people. The world of the living is steady, and so is this king of the people. In this way, traditional states and empires often employed the symbols of centrality and of polarity that have been associated with the archetype of regality. End quote. Okay, so a bunch of stuff in here about law and the state, but first is that all the laws have to be consecrated by divine power. The section here I want to draw your eye to is where he says, traditional man either ignored or considered absurd the idea that one could talk about laws and the obedience due them, as if the laws in question had a mere human origin, whether individual or collective. Every law, in order to be regarded as an objective law, had to have a divine character. Once the divine character of a law was sanctioned and its origin traced back to a non-human tradition, then its authority became absolute, and the law became something ineffable, inflexible, immutable, beyond criticism. So now he talks about the usefulness of these laws and the usefulness of, but I think that we should consider not only the usefulness of the laws, but the usefulness of this notion that laws come from a divine source, because I think that this sort of view of law proved immensely useful for getting people to conform with the law. If you are a member of a civilization and you think that your transgressions against the law cannot be hidden, they cannot be concealed, even if you conceal them from your fellows, you can't conceal them from the gods, and you will still be punished. Those people are more willing to adhere closely to the laws because they fear a punishment above and beyond what their fellow members of the society are capable of delivering, a level of oversight that their fellows are incapable of delivering. There's a sort of fear that has to exist in order for one to follow the laws completely. Now, you don't have to be a completely fearful person, but in some sense, some concept that there's a punishment in there for you somewhere if you break the laws. If that fear is expanded and made ever present by a myth, then that myth can enhance the solidity of the civilization. Now, there may be downsides to that myth, to believing in certain things. There could certainly be downsides. But if you can craft mythologies in such a way that believing in them offers minimal downsides and maximum upsides, maximum benefit from believing in this particular mythological system, right? All mythologies aren't created the same. All belief systems aren't created the same. But if you can craft the belief system in such a way that it has the maximum benefit, and I'm not saying this was crafted deliberately, I'm saying that mythologies go through evolutionary processes, just like people do. And myths and stories and concepts about the world that prove beneficial and that spread easily, these are the so-called mind viruses. But they're beneficial. Ideas are beneficial. And they're most beneficial, generally speaking, they're most beneficial when they're true. But in some cases, I think you can find benefit from ideas regardless of whether they're true, based on how they change people's behavior. This is an extremely materialistic interpretation, but I think this interpretation is the core and spreads to the concept of kingship rather than vice versa. I don't believe that the concept of divinity first hit the king and then spread to the laws that the king makes, but instead first hit the laws and then spread to the givers of the laws by the usefulness of having the laws and having people follow the laws. And of course, the usefulness of having people obey the king. But just having people obey the king doesn't necessarily prove useful to society. A lot would depend on what the king wants, what the king commands, how the king rules. But to have a set of social norms that have gone through an evolutionary process where they change, they modify bit by bit, generation over generation, until they settle into a stable set of laws that are consecrated by something that transcends the capabilities of the guardians and the overseers of the society. I believe that's the origin point, myself. But let's keep moving. He talks a little bit about sacred rites, and by which I mean R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T. Sacred rites, sacred activities, religious rituals. He says, quote, "As the king, by divine right, was the center of the traditional state, two elements, right and faithfulness, connected particular components and activities within the social order to this center, and allowed individuals to partake of the transcendent influence emanating from the sovereign. The rite was the original cement, binding together traditional organizations, whether large or small, considered in their non-naturalistic dimensions. The rite was, first of all, the prerogative of the king, second, of the aristocratic or priestly classes and of the magistrates, whom the Greeks called oi en iteli, those whose responsibility is to perform sacrifices, and finally of the patres, or heads of household. Rites and sacrifices were regulated by detailed and strict traditional norms that left no room for anything arbitrary or subjective. The performance of rites and sacrifices was imperative, ius strictum. A ritual or sacrifice that was neglected or performed by an unqualified person or performed in a way that did not conform to traditional rules was considered a cause of misfortune for both individuals and society, since it unleashed dreadful powers both in the moral and in the material order. Conversely, in the classical world, it was said that the priest in charge of the holy fire saved the city through his ritual day after day. In the Chinese tradition, to establish the rites was the first of the three most important things in the government of an empire, since the rites were the channels by which we can apprehend the ways of heaven. In the Hindu tradition, the sacrificial sites were considered to be the seats of the cosmic order itself. It is very significant that the expression rata, artha in Persian, appears in connection with analogous conceptions of the root of the Latin word ritus, ritual action. In the ancient traditional way of life, both at an individual and at a collective level, every action was connected with a determined ritual element that acted as its support and as the transfiguring and guiding element from above. The tradition of rites and sacrifices, which was often confused with the legislative tradition, hence the notion of ius sacrum, referred both in the private and in the public dimensions to a non-human being or to a being who had transcended the human condition. This can hardly be comprehended by the modern secular mentality that views every ritual as either outdated superstition or a mere ceremony to be appreciated merely for the sake of its symbolical, aesthetical, or emotional value." End quote. So I didn't want to get into a great amount of detail there. I just like that sentence, that section. He says the rite was the original cement, binding together traditional organizations, whether large or small, considered in their non-naturalistic dimensions. The rite was first of all the prerogative of the king, second of the aristocratic or priestly classes and of the magistrates, and finally of the patres, or head of household. So there's a certain figures that have the authority to perform certain rites, certain rituals, and this belongs to the head of household, belongs to the king, the aristocrats, the priests, people with authority. They perform these rites, but it seems as though the rites are also, in a way, participated in. I mean, if you think about ancient rituals, the people would attend, and sometimes they had roles to play in the rituals and the sacrifices. It's a cement that binds together the society, and I think it may have a certain person who leads the rite, but and perhaps performs the sacrifice, but there's involvement from the whole community. And of course, we know that there are psychological effects of repetition. And when people think that they share these rights with their forefathers, he talks about the fire. And he says that in the classical world, it was said that the priest in charge of the holy fire saved the city through his ritual. And the Chinese say this is among the most important things the government can do, is oversee the rituals and sacrifices. And they say that these were the channels by which we can apprehend the ways of heaven. In a sense, it's a confirmation of your dedication to the culture. You all have a shared culture. Everyone in your community has a shared culture, and the sacrifices and rituals and rites and religious concerns of the culture can be demonstrated when one performs these rites. They've dedicated themselves to the rituals of the community and to the perseverance of the community. And of course, he takes a dig in at the modern secular mentality that views rituals as outdated. I view rituals as important from a secular perspective, but serving a function in society, just like the law, just like the monarchy. These all serve functions, and the function is the long-term stability of the society, the society's ability to produce children and expand itself in the following generations, to serve the interests of the ethnic group that comprises the society. To craft a continuity between generations. The continuity between generations is genetic. The continuity among various members of a society is genetic. But the dedication to the society is reinforced with the rituals, common rituals, chanting, I think. I would say that the participation amongst the other people, even if you just go to church, you still have to sort of say something from time to time. You have to say amen. You have to do something. You have to clasp your hands and bow your head. You have to participate in some way to symbolize and convey your participation in the shared order. So despite the fact that the rites are the domain of the leaders and the people in authority to lead the rites, there's a participation that's involved. Anyhow, I'm going to move to where he talks about aristocracy here. He says, quote, "A Latin expression characterized the plebeians as gentem non habent, people who have no rights nor ancestors. This is why in ancient Rome the patricians viewed the plebeians' lifestyle and sexual coupling as similar to that of wild animals. Thus the supernatural element was the foundation of the idea of a traditional patriciate and of legitimate royalty. What constituted an ancient aristocrat was not merely a biological legacy or a racial selection, but rather a sacred tradition. In fact, even an animal may have biological and racial purity. After all, in the caste system, the laws of blood, heredity, and endogamic restrictions did not apply only to the Brahmana, but to the other castes as well. It was not in this sense that the plebeian was said to lack ancestors. The true principle of the differentiation between patricians and plebeians was that the ancestors of the plebeian and of the slave were not divine ancestors, like the ancestors of the patrician stocks. No transcendent quality or form entrusted to a rigorous and secret ritual tradition was transmitted to them through the blood. The plebeians lacked that power, through which the members of the aristocracy could directly celebrate their own cults, or be members of the priestly class, as was the case in the ancient classical world, in ancient northern and Germanic races, in the Far East, and so on. The plebeians did not have the privilege of the second birth that characterized the Arya, and the Manu Dharma Sastra does not hesitate to say that even an Arya is not superior to the Sudra until he has been born again. The plebeians were not purified by any of the three heavenly fires that, in ancient Iran, were believed to act as the occult souls of the three higher castes in the empire. The plebeians also lacked the solar element that, in ancient Peru, characterized the race of the Incas. The plebeians' promiscuity had no limits. They had no true cult of their own, and in a higher sense they had no founding father. Therefore, the plebeians' religion could not help but have a collective and chthonic character. In India, their religion was characterized by frenzied and ecstatic forms, more or less connected to the substratum of the pre-Aryan races. In the Mediterranean civilizations, the plebeians' religion was characterized by the cult of the mothers and by subterranean forces, instead of the luminous forms of the heroic and Olympian tradition. The plebeians, who in ancient Rome were called children of the earth, had a religious devotion to the feminine deities of the earth. Even in China, the official aristocratic religion stood in contrast with the practices of those who are often called obsessed, and with the popular cults of a Mongolian and shamanic type. We find the supernatural conception of the aristocracy also in ancient Teutonic traditions, not only because in these traditions every leader was at the same time the high priest of his people and of his lands, but also because claiming as an ancestor a divine being was enough to separate a family from all the others. A king was then chosen exclusively from among the members of these privileged families. This is why the king enjoyed a different dignity from that enjoyed, for instance, by a military leader who was occasionally appointed in military situations on the basis of his recognized individual talents. It seems that ancient Norwegian kings celebrated the rites by themselves, without the help of the priestly class. Even among the so-called primitive populations, those who had not been initiated were looked down upon by their own people, and excluded from all the military and political privileges of their clan. Before undergoing rites that were destined to transform one's innermost nature, and that were often associated with hard trials and with a period of isolation, a person was not considered to be a true man, but was rather seen as belonging to the same class as women, children, and animals. An individual became a member of the group of true men who control the community only through the new life awakened in him by initiation, almost as if he partook of a mystery or joined an order. Once an individual partakes of this new life, which is almost unrelated to the old one, he receives a new name, a new language, and new attributions. Thus, authors such as H. Schertz have rightfully seen in this the germ of true political unity. This insight corroborates what I have said before concerning the plane proper to any traditional state, which is different from the plane typical of any unity built on merely naturalistic premises. These virile groups, to which one is admitted after a regeneration that truly confers manhood and differentiates a person from all other members of the community, enjoy power, imperium, and an undisputed prestige." End quote. So here you have this difference between the patricians and the plebeians. And what it really comes down to here, according to the ancient ways, according to the traditional ways, is that the patricians can trace their ancestry to a deity. That's really at the core here. He says it's not that they have some sort of biological superiority or racial superiority. There's nothing biological or racial about it or anything like that. He says what really differentiated them, the true principle of differentiation between patricians and plebeians, was that the ancestors of the plebeian were not divine ancestors, whereas the ancestors of the patricians were divine. And a sort of divinity is passed down through the blood from father to son, a connection with an ancient mythical past. And the plebeians lack this connection. And I think that, I'm a fan of aristocracy, but I think we should maintain a little bit of the biological and racial concepts that are involved here. You're talking about a family, and you're talking about multiple generations. You're talking about something, a title that is passed down from generation to generation, some sort of prestige, some sort of status that you have merely by being a part of a certain family. It's not earned. It's not intended to be earned. This isn't meritocratic. This is your connection to a mythical past, your connection to an ethnic group. And I feel like the aristocrats, right, this is flexible. It's not like they can just do whatever and always maintain their aristocratic position. In some sense, there's a permanence that is implied here, and I haven't really mentioned this yet, but the whole traditional world, he keeps kind of talking about being and becoming and permanence and stuff, and one of the whole premise, prime concepts of traditionalism in the traditional world is that it's constituted by permanent things. And this is based on its opposition to the material world, which is clearly filled with temporary things. All sorts of things in the material world are temporary. Now, we start to find some permanence in the sense that matter and energy can never be destroyed. There's a sort of permanence in, obviously, mathematics and things. Some things have permanence, but the material world is generally considered to be a world of shifting, changing things. And only by transcending the world of the inferior world of the shifting nature to the transcendent world of the spiritual permanence can you escape this temporary thing. And so the kingship and the aristocrats, they sort of touch on infinity a little bit. They touch on permanence. They touch the world of eternity, the divine, eternal things. And so this is like a connection. And it's similar to the fire, where a society, a town, even a family, they have a fire that's a sacred fire. And they can't let it go out. They have to maintain it perpetually. And if it goes out, that's a terrible omen, right? It's this sort of permanence. The fire doesn't get lit and go out and get lit and go out. It's always burning. And it's not really, I don't know how many of them believed that the fire had literally always been burning, but the fire finds its origin in a god or a divine figure who established the family, some divine ancestor, and through that divine ancestor, the connection to permanence is continued, right? Once the ancestry hits the gods, then they can find their ancestry back to the first beings in reality, the first chaos and the first primordial gods and goddesses that even Zeus himself is a descendant from. Gaia, Oranos, the most ancient. They find their heritage connects back to the most ancient. There's a seeking after eternity, a pursuit of eternity in the pursuit of this sort of transcendence. What's really being transcended is mortality, temporariness, particularness. And what's being sought after is always the universal, the eternal, closer and closer to infinity. And being that I'm a materialist, I want to say, what we're after is something like genetic success, right? What we're after is that you can trace back your ancestors for an extended period of time and find that you sort of become the pole, the ideal, the manifestation of what is and is not part of the ethnic core, materialistically, genetically, ethnically. What constitutes a people is ethnic ties, genetic ties. And if your family goes back a tremendous amount of time in a certain place, among a certain people, within a certain society, like if you're a noble family of Rome, your people presumably go back a long ways in Rome to the early Roman founders, right? It's through the early Romans that the connection to the gods is established. We can trace our ancestry all the way back to Remus and Romulus. We can trace our ancestry back to Odysseus, through these ancient family ties. Nobody just waltzes into Rome and, from Syria and says, my family has a connection to the Syrian gods, You may get respected, but if you're a pauper, nobody's going to believe you. You would have to be a member of the Syrian aristocracy. And I think you would be respected, but it would always be as a foreigner. You want to trace your history to the Roman gods. You want to trace your history to the Roman people. And so ethnicity and race, while he sort of discounts them, biology, I think they're core to what should be the aristocracy of any society. They are the lodestones. They are the cornerstones of defining who is and is not a member of the society, how close you are to this or that noble family. You have some ancestor that ties in. Your family has been serving this noble house for such and such generations. You are bound in through service, through oaths. You are bound into this divine family. You get a little bit of the divinity. And the divinity is ethnic. The Roman gods, the Greek gods. You connect to the gods of your people, then you are part of the clan. Anyway, let's move forward a little bit more about the patriciate. He says, quote, "The ritual and sacred element was the foundation of the authority of both the higher castes and of the father in the ancient patrician family. In Western Aryan societies, such as Greece and Rome, the pater familiae originally enjoyed a status similar to that of the priest-king. The term pater was synonymous with king. It conveyed the idea of a spiritual authority as well as that of power and majestic dignity. According to some views, with which I totally concur, the state is an application on a larger scale of the same principle that in the beginning constituted the patrician family. Therefore the pater, though he was the military leader and the lord of justice of his relatives and slaves, in the beginning and before all was the person entrusted with performing those traditional rites and sacrifices proper to every family, the rites and sacrifices that constituted its non-human legacy. This legacy, which emanated from the founding father, was represented by fire. For example, the 30 fires of the 30 families surrounding the central fire of Vesta in ancient Rome. This fire, which was fed with special substances and lit according to specific rituals and secret norms, was supposed to be kept burning at all times by every family, as the living and tangible witness of its divine legacy. The father was the virile priest in charge of tending to the sacred family fire, and servants, or like the natural mediator of every efficacious relationship with the supernatural, or like the supreme vivifier of the mystical force of the ritual, which was present in the substance of fire, or like the incarnation of order, as Agni was to the Indo-Aryans, or like the principle that brings the gods to us, or like the firstborn from order, or like the son of strength, or like he who leads us away from this world to higher dimensions into the world of right action. The pater's main responsibility was to prevent the fire from going out, so that it might continue to reproduce, perpetuate, and nourish the mystical victory of the ancestor. This responsibility to the fire was the manifestation of the regal component of his family, with the pater being the lord of the spear and of the sacrifice. In this way, the pater really constituted the center of the family. The entire rigorous constitution of traditional paternal rights flowed from this center as a natural consequence, and it subsisted even when the awareness of its primordial foundation was lost. In ancient Rome, anyone who, like the pater, had the ius quiritum, the right to bear the lance and to perform sacrifices, also had the right to own land. His privileges could never be abrogated. He spoke on behalf of the gods and on account of power. Just like the gods, he expressed himself through symbols and signs. He was immaterial. Originally, it was not possible to prosecute a patrician legally, since he was regarded as a minister of the gods, just like the king in recent times. If the patrician committed a crime in his mundus, the curia would only declare that he did something wicked. His rights over his relatives were absolute. His superhuman character made it natural for him to sell and even to put to death his own children at his discretion. It was in this spirit that the articulations of what Vico rightly called natural heroic rights or divine rights of heroic people were formulated. End quote. So here you have a little bit about the pater, the head of the ancient patrician family. These are the leaders of the founding families of Rome. What I like is he says that this legacy which emanated from the founding father was represented by fire. And he gives the example of the fires of 30 families that surround the central fire of Vesta in ancient Rome. So I don't know the details here, but it sounds like there's a central fire that's the fire of the goddess Vesta, who is the goddess of the hearth, and sort of rules over the hearth fires of the various families, probably is the goddess of families, the goddess of the preservation of family traditions. Vesta is the goddess of fire, but more so the goddess of the fires of the family, and the goddess of the fire of Rome. Just as every family has its own fire, Rome itself has a fire, and that's the fire of Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth. And each of these family fires was a microcosm of this larger fire, and they all had to be kept going, and the Vestal virgins, I guess, kept the fire of Vesta going, and the heads of the family ultimately were responsible for keeping their own fires burning. I don't think they themselves were there tending the fire. I think they delegated that, but ultimately the responsibility for the family fell to the pater, and they had great authority in their family, absolute authority in their family. How one person was determined to be the head of the family. Presumably this was by blood. Membership in the family passed from father to son. In the same way that we pass on last names to husbands from father to son to father to son, the son keeps the name of his father. We don't see it as sacred anymore, but it was almost as if there was a substance passed from father to son, some sort of sacredness that was passed from father to son. Membership in the clan was a sacred thing. Participation in the fire. This all seems like genetic to me. It has genetic overtones. Like when he talks about, he says the pater's main responsibility was to prevent the fire from going out so that it might continue to reproduce, perpetuate, and nourish the mystical victory of the ancestor. So the ancestor is nourished, the mystical victory of the ancestor, the hero who has founded the family, is nourished even after death by the burning of the fire. The fire is the manifestation of the regal component of his family. So you see like how I can see this sounds sort of like genetic continuity, and I've drawn the comparison between genetic success and eudaimonia in the past, and I think you could see all of these things sort of similar. The fire of the family, the ever-present burning that passes from the fathers to the sons, the cohesion of the rights of the families and the societies, the connection between state, society, family, senate, patricians, plebeians. It's all very genetic. It all has to do with families and relatedness and a connection to the ancient past of the people, a connection to the ancient history of the people, which means a genetic connection to the tribe. All very interesting stuff from Julius Evola. So as I've said, while I disagree with his, the core premise that illuminates the whole book, it's nevertheless very interesting and useful, and I think points to very functional systems of government. Functional in terms of the immediate success of the people, and functional in terms of course, the genetic success of the tribe. So thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.